Hey team, we're here for chapter 5 of Bloom by Kenneth Oppel. Some of you, if you listen to Oppel's family do the reading, have listened to part of chapter 5. So I'm going to start at the beginning of chapter 5, go to the end of chapter 5, and some might be a refresher for you. Chapter 5. Here's what we know, Anaya's father told the people crammed into the community center. Its spread is worldwide. We've seen it growing in tundra, in rainforest. There's even reports of it in the desert. So far, it's totally herbicide resistant. We've tried them all. It shares characteristics with a bunch of known plants, but right now the thinking is it's an entirely new species. Anaya was relieved that Dad managed to use it when talking about the black grass today. She wasn't sure anyone wanted to hear it referred to as dude or fascinating right now, especially after what had happened at the Antos farm. Every chair in the community center was filled, and people jostled along the sides and crunched together at the back. Even with all the open windows, the smell was pretty ripe. Salt Spring was earthy. There were lots of people who didn't believe in things like deodorant or soap or even socks. They believed in composting and damp wool and meetings. Most of them seemed to love meetings. From the sidelines, Anaya watched her father. He was right up front with the island trustees and governing council, sitting behind a long table with flex microphones. Sergeant Sumner, Petra's mom, was up there too, representing the RCMP. Scanning the crowd, Anaya caught sight of Seth near the back in his usual hoodie, standing beside Mrs. Antos, who looked pale and weary. "Anaya, how are you?" someone asked, and she felt a soft touch on her arm. It was Mr. Sumner and Petra. "Oh, hi," she said. She always felt awkward and sad when she ran into them. Mr. and Mrs. Sumner were always polite to her, and sometimes seemed a bit wistful, like they didn't understand why she and Petra weren't friends anymore. Like they didn't know their own daughter was a disloyal backstabber who'd chucked her aside when she got ugly. She lifted her hand at Petra. "Hey." Petra stretched her mouth into a grudging smile. "How's Mr. Antos?" Anaya asked. She figured Mr. Sumner would know since he worked at the hospital. "He's okay. He was very lucky, really. He inhaled a lot of the smoke, and it really damaged his lungs. Seth probably saved his life." Anaya glanced back at Seth. Everyone had heard how he dragged Mr. Antos clear. "We have some stuff we wanted to show your father," Mr. Sumner said to her. "Some plants Petra found. It might be useful." "I'll tell him," Anaya said, and felt relieved when they moved on through the crowd. From the front of the hall, her father was saying, "Under no circumstances should you try to burn it. How come no one told us it was toxic?" Anaya looked around, trying to find the person who'd shouted out the question. It was Tom Gutman, who had a farm near Wicked Point. Normally at these meetings, people lined up at the mic and patiently waited their turn. "We should have known," someone else shouted. Anaya shifted awkwardly. They were almost making it sound like Dad was to blame for what happened. "We didn't know yet," he replied. Sergeant Sumner leaned into her mic. "We're imposing a fire ban, effective immediately. We can't have any more of that stuff set alight." "So, where do we put it all?" someone else asked. "I'm running out of space." "And it starts rooting again, even after you cut it down," another person called out. "We need it off our land." "We're finding a site where you can haul it," Sergeant Sumner said. "We'll have that location for you by the end of tomorrow." "What are we supposed to do about our crops?" That was Tom Gutman again. "I know this is very hard," Dad said, "but for now, tilling is your only option." And he started outlining possible ways to save crops. Someone tapped her shoulder, and Anaya looked over to see Teresa and Fleetwood. "I thought you didn't believe in town meetings," she whispered to her friend. "Fleetwood wanted to come," Teresa said in a dreary drawl. "He has theories. Doesn't everyone?" Fleetwood said. Teresa looked at Anaya closely, smiled, and whispered into her ear, "Your face." Anaya flushed with pleasure. The last couple mornings, when she'd peek warily at herself in the mirror, her acne looked a bit calmer. There were definitely fewer pimples, and they looked less angry. Also, the skin around her eyes wasn't nearly so puffy, so you could actually see her eyes. Anaya couldn't help smiling, even though it seemed completely frivolous to be thinking about her own complexion right now. We might lose our entire growing season, a woman in the hall said loudly. Is the government going to compensate us? Or feed my goats? Someone else called out. There's no grazing for them. They can't eat black grass. It's too spiky. While one of the trustees stuttered out a reply, Anaya noticed Ralph Jenkins step out into the aisle and make his way toward the mic. He was one of the oldest residents of the island and generally considered a weirdo. He'd built his very own druidic standing stones and rented out his land as a spiritual retreat. He tapped the mic, sending a metallic shrill through the hall. My name is Ralph Jenkins, he said slowly and clearly. Here we go, murmured Anaya. We know who you are, Ralph, someone called out, to a few chuckles. There is something you are not telling us, Ralph Jenkins said, his amplified voice cutting through the chatter. There is something you're not telling us, and we have a right to know. I love this guy, said Teresa, who looked interested for the first time. Anaya noticed that Fleetwood was nodding intently. Our government is not telling us where this weed comes from. Very good point, said Fleetwood. Because it sure seems to me, said Ralph Jenkins, that this weed would only be bioterrorism. There were shouts of agreement and scattered applause. We want the truth, someone called out. This stuff didn't just come out of nowhere. Ralph Jenkins said, I hear the news like everyone else. The U.S. blames China, and China blames them right back. And then everybody blames North Korea because they're so secretive. You've got the Middle East blaming people. Nobody's blamed Canada yet, Teresa said wryly. We're too nice. Please, Mr. Riggs, said Ralph Jenkins, tell us what you know. Is this something that escaped from your farm or some other experimental facility? Anaya looked back to her father. He'd been an islander almost all his life, and everyone knew and mostly liked him. The guy at the Esso station had a weird hatred of him for some reason. But Dad was also an employee of the Ministry of Agriculture, which was the federal government, and so that meant Dad knew things and kept secrets, which was ridiculous. Ralph, I can honestly tell you, this plant did not escape from my farm or any facility in our country, and I know there's been a lot of finger pointing in the media, but every country on the planet has been equally hard hit. That could just be part of their plan, Fleetwood whispered. Oh, Fleetwood, said Teresa. No, seriously, he said, turning his intense gaze from Teresa to Anaya. Don't you think? She smiled back awkwardly, feeling herself blush. Fleetwood hardly ever looked at her. Well, it seems to me, said Ralph Jenkins, that unless we get rid of this stuff, the planet's not going to be producing much food this year. Anaya chewed her upper lip. Ralph Jenkins wasn't sounding so crazy right now. According to Dad and the news, all across the northern hemisphere, farmers were having trouble planting their crops. We're working on it, Ralph. Not just Canada, but every country in the world. We'll get this stuff under control. Seriously, Fleetwood was whispering, if you wanted to take over the world, you'd make it look like you were infested with blackgrass too, so no one suspected you, right? But you'd actually have an antidote. And when everyone else ran out of food and started to starve, then you'd sell the antidote for $1 trillion. That's a pretty good plan, Anaya admitted. For a James Bond movie, Teresa added. Then, oh my gosh, he's still talking. And I can't be the only person here, Ralph Jenkins rambled on, who noticed that all this stuff started growing right after the big rain we had. Sorry, Mr. Jenkins, said Dad. You're saying the rain... Very next day it comes up. Is that a coincidence? I think not. I did predict this, of course, in my podcast last year. People started telling him to sit down. Eventually, Ralph threw up his hands in disgust and stalked off. I think Mr. Jenkins might be right, said a voice near the front. And with astonishment, Anaya realized it was Petra. There she was, walking up to the mic with perfect poise. That took guts, Anaya thought grudgingly. Then again, Petra had always loved being the center of attention. When they were little, they were both bossy, but Petra usually managed to end up with the best crayons, the best action figure, the best part in the basement plays they'd put on. She loved being in front of people, but what on earth was she doing right now? I think the seeds were in the rain, Petra said. The crowd was very quiet suddenly. Whoa, Teresa mouthed to Anaya. Hot gossip. What makes you say that, Petra? Anaya heard Dad ask. I collected some of it, the rain, because, well, for some reason I'm not allergic to it. Anaya rolled her eyes as a murmur of sympathy burbled up from the audience. Did the entire island know about Petra's tragic water allergy? Anyway, this morning there were little plants growing inside the bottles. They were all different, but I'm pretty sure one was the black grass. Anaya saw Dad nodding patiently. I'd like to look at those plants if you still have them, he said, but I think it's more likely the seeds got blown into the water or fell from overhanging vegetation. It came with the rain, hollered Ralph Jenkins from his seat. How do you explain the rest of the world then? Someone shouted back. It rained all over the world, Fleetwood boomed out, and Anaya looked at him in surprise. Teresa actually held out her hand over her face in embarrassment. It was on the news, remember? Fleetwood said, stammering a bit now. They had satellite pictures, and it was all cloud, and it rained pretty much everywhere on the planet over a 3-day period, so... He trailed off, but he was right. Anaya remembered watching the news with her parents, and the weather guy had mentioned how unusual it was. She watched her father's face. She could tell he was thinking hard. It looked like he was going to speak, but one of the counselors bent over her mic and said, I think we can discuss these interesting theories after the meeting, but we have some other important business to address. We need volunteer crews to keep the grass under control. I can't believe you, Teresa whispered to Fleetwood, her face still flushed. You actually think someone made it rain all over the world? Hey, I'm not the only one. On the internet, Fleetwood, we've talked about this. Everything is on the internet. We can control the weather now. Oh boy, Teresa looked at Anaya, shaking her head. Anaya smiled back weakly, but she couldn't dismiss it. Dad didn't. She could tell by the serious look on his face. The Chinese have this whole government department in charge of the weather, Fleetwood was saying. They can make it rain. So you think it was the Chinese, Teresa said? I just said it maybe is possible, theoretically, to make it rain all over the planet at once. Okay, said Teresa. So how did they deliver all the seeds? 1 million airplanes? Fleetwood looked defeated. Yeah, I guess we would have seen the planes on our radars and stuff. Cloaking technology, said Teresa, slipping her hand into Fleetwood's. Fleetwood grinned and winked at Anaya. Yeah, maybe. Anaya laughed, feeling some anxiety leave her shoulders. It did sound pretty far-fetched. Teresa kissed Fleetwood on the cheek. Maybe it's not even a country doing this. Maybe it's a secret organization called Slork or something. And an evil dude with scary glasses, said Anaya, biding his time in his underground lair with his supermodels and personal chef. And pet Komodo dragon, Fleetwood added, then sneezed. Teresa sneezed too and laughed. Then she sneezed again and kept sneezing. Anaya was suddenly aware of all the other people sneezing from every part of the hall. It sounded like some sort of malfunctioning engine. People held their elbows and tissues to their mouths. There was something scary about it, like everyone had suddenly lost control of their bodies. She looked up at her father at the front and saw him sneezing too. Inside, the light had changed somehow. Anaya tilted her face up to the windows. The air glittered with dust or something. She was pushed along with the tide of people heading for the doors. Outside, all around the sides of the parking lot, grew black grass. The very tallest stalks looked different, and it only took Anaya a second to understand why. Just yesterday, the flowers on the tall central stems were still tight black buds. Now they were open. To Anaya, they looked a bit like black sunflowers. The centers bristled with pale pollen. A horn honked at her. She stepped out of the way of a car trying to leave the parking lot, windows rolled up, the driver jerking with sneezes. Anaya walked closer to the black grass, staring up at the flowers. The breeze rustled the stalks together. Maybe it was the unpleasant scraping sound or the big face-like flowers, but Anaya had never felt so keenly that the grass had an intelligence. With a faint creak, one of the flowers tilted its head skyward. The long black stem arched and swelled. The flower trembled and then snapped forward. With a loud pop that made Anaya jolt, 1,000 tiny grains of pollen exploded through the air. A second pop made her turn as more flowers released their mist of pollen. Everywhere, the flowers arched and recoiled as their pollen shot through the air like fireworks. The parking lot was chaos now, people shouting and sneezing and hurrying to their cars, doors slamming, cars starting, horns blaring. Overhead, the air was heavy with pollen, the sunlight illuminating the golden grains as they danced and swirled higher in the heat of the afternoon, and Anaya thought, that is one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. Across the parking lot, she caught sight of Seth and Petra. They weren't sneezing at all, and neither was she. It was weird for Petra, stepping inside Anaya's house after so long, but right away she remembered the frayed mat, the homemade shoe rack, the wall-mounted coat hooks in the shape of elephant tusks, and the familiar, faintly spicy fragrance of the house itself. She used to spend so much time here, and with a pang she realized how much she missed it. "Thanks for bringing them over," said Mr. Riggs, looking at the bottles of water she carried. "Come into the kitchen." Her father sneezed again. On the way over, it hadn't been so bad inside the car with the windows rolled up. The pollen had swirled against the windshield, forming little drifts against the wipers. Even the short dash from the car to the Riggs' front door had made Dad's eyes and nose stream. But she herself was absolutely fine, and she had no idea why. Mr. Riggs said, "Cal, we've got plenty of allergy meds." Her father nodded gratefully. "Yes, please. What do you have?" When they walked into the kitchen, Anaya was already popping a pill from a blister pack. "Might I recommend 10 milligrams of cetrazine?" she said. "You certainly know your pharmaceuticals," Petra's father chuckled. "I'm kind of an expert," Anaya replied, offering him the pill with a glass of water. Petra didn't laugh. So typical of Anaya to show off how clever she was. She loved being smart. Whenever the teachers returned tests, she'd always smile and leave her paper face up on the desk so everyone could see her marks. If someone answered a question wrong in class, she'd do this little head shake and then lift her hand really high. Petra got good marks too, but she wasn't so obnoxious about it. "Do you want some antihistamines too?" Anaya asked her. "I'm good." She noticed Anaya wasn't sneezing at all and seemed kind of smug about it. Her face also looked less pimply and puffy than usual. You could almost notice how pretty her mouth and eyes were, which irritated Petra even more. She set her bottles down on the wooden table and saw Anaya watching closely, enviously even. Inwardly, Petra smiled. Did Anaya have any strange plant specimens? No. Had Anaya figured out the seeds must have come with the rain? No. Take that, smart girl. "So let's see what you've got there," Mr. Riggs said, bending close to the bottles. "This growth happened all overnight?" "Yes." "Okay, I'm just going to dump the water out here," Mr. Riggs said, taking one of the bottles to the sink where a colander was waiting. "Oh," said Petra, "do you mind saving it? It's just..." She snuck a glance at Anaya, who raised a curious eyebrow. Petra didn't care what she thought. She still wanted the water to wash with, even if the weird stuff had grown in it. She couldn't bear the idea of losing it. "Right, sure," said Mr. Riggs. He put a big pot under the colander and drained the first bottle. He brought the colander back to the table, lifted out the 2 black stalks, and then placed them on the plastic cutting board. Everyone crowded around. "Okay, this is definitely the same grass we've got everywhere. What's impressive is the seeds germinated in water and didn't rot. These dudes are very adaptable." "They don't look very healthy, though," said Petra. "In the ground, that stuff grows 4 feet overnight." "True," Mr. Riggs said. "He definitely prefers a terrestrial home. Okay, next." He drained the next bottle. Inside was the plant with the bat-shaped leaves, which were plastered against the plastic sides. "Do you want a pair of chopsticks?" Anaya said. "Good idea," her father said. "I don't want to tear them." Using the chopsticks, Mr. Riggs delicately gripped the plant and eased it out through the neck. Seeing it spread flat on the cutting board, Petra was surprised how big the leaves were. All this just overnight, in the darkness of the medicine cabinet. She looked at their fine black veins, the tiny hairs. "The leaves are quite fleshy," Mr. Riggs said, handling them gently. "Perfectly symmetrical. And see?" He touched a small bulge in the plant's center. "I think this might be a flowering stem beginning here. It reminds me of a water lily." Same black color as the grass, Petra said. Do you think they're related, Mr. Riggs? Possibly. Let's have a look at this one. At the sink, he poured out the third bottle and returned with the colander. Resting on the bottom were 3 black peas. Petra frowned. The tiny shoots looked longer than they had inside the bottle. These guys, Mr. Riggs remarked, look a bit like very tiny bulbs. Does that mean they're flowers? Petra asked. Could be. A flower bulb usually has multiple roots at the bottom, though. These guys just have a single shoot growing from this bud here, right at the pointy end. He picked up one of the bulbs. They're very young. The shoots are still undifferentiated. Undifferentiated, she said, and was sorry she did because Anaya answered. They haven't started forming leaves or branching off yet. Petra caught Mr. Riggs give his daughter an approving nod and tried not to roll her eyes. Her own dad asked, have you ever seen anything like this, Mike? No, and it's hard to know what this one's going to become. As he held it close to his face, Petra saw a bead of fluid leak from the bulb onto the pad of his thumb. Huh? Mr. Riggs said, setting down the bulb and sniffing the liquid. He rubbed it between his fingertips, then frowned. Abruptly, he stood up and hurried to the sink. Dad? Anaya said worriedly. Mr. Riggs turned on the tap and held his hand under the water. That has a nasty sting to it, he said over his shoulder. Don't touch it. Let's take a look, said Petra's dad. When Mr. Riggs returned, Petra could see the angry blisters on his fingertips. Hard to tell if it's an allergic reaction or an acid burn, her dad said. She looked back down at the bulb and gave a cry as its shoot twitched. Holy crap, it just moved. I saw it too, Anaya said. Their eyes met, and just for a second, it was like they were friends again. You sure, Petra? Her dad asked. Yeah, it was just like, it just grew. Does it look a little longer to you guys? She didn't know much about plants, but you weren't supposed to be able to see them growing. Anaya, Mr. Riggs said, could you get some Ziploc bags and wet paper towels to pack these things up? Put on gloves before handling the bulbs. Sure thing. Thanks for bringing these, Petra, Mr. Riggs said. This is incredibly useful. He pointed at the bulbs and the bat leaf plant. I haven't seen reports of these varieties yet. He shook his head. 3 new plant species and 1 sample of rainwater. Seems like quite the coincidence, doesn't it? So you think it's possible, she asked him, the seeds were actually in the rain? Hard to dismiss, Mr. Riggs said. Petra cut a sidelong glance at Anaya. She couldn't help gloating. Maybe she was the first person to come up with the idea. The first person who wasn't crazy anyway. So hang on, said her father. If the seeds were all delivered together, it means someone's doing this, right? Bioterrorism? Mr. Riggs nodded gravely. I'll be calling the ministry. Petra watched Anaya packing the plants into Ziploc bags. Is it safe for me to keep washing with the water? Because of the seeds, I mean? Mr. Riggs considered her question. Well, it hasn't hurt you so far, but probably best not to. He held up his red fingertips. You don't want anything like this getting on your skin or eyes. Okay, she nodded, trying to hide her disappointment. So what happens next? I'll transplant these few seedlings at the farm, Mr. Riggs said, and grow them in controlled conditions. We need to know what else we're facing. Seth brought the tractor around in a 180 turn, still a little sloppy, but he was definitely getting the hang of it. In the late afternoon light, row by row, he cut down a new crop of black grass. After every burn, even after the burn, the very next morning, the field had bristled with new stalks. Today, they were all as tall as Seth. When he'd visited Mr. Antos in the hospital earlier today, Seth had promised him he'd keep the grass under control. Thanks, Seth, Mr. Antos said, but this is ridiculous. Why am I still here? He turned to his wife, who just had a coughing fit. You sound worse than me, Marta. You're inside, his wife told him in annoyance, and on oxygen. Seth could tell her new allergies infuriated Mrs. Antos, even if everyone on the island was suffering equally. Still, Mr. Antos said stubbornly, I'm fine. I don't know why they're not releasing me. Mrs. Antos blew her nose and glared at the tissue. The doctor said your lungs were scarred, and I believe them. I only got a couple of mouthfuls, and that smoke seared all the way down my chest. They want to keep you in for a few more days, said Seth, just to be safe. Mr. Antos gave a mighty sigh, which started him coughing. I want to get back to the farm. Seth wanted him back too, and he was surprised by how much. A father was not a difficult thing to imagine, even if you'd never had one. Seth had spent a lot of time watching other people's fathers, from a distance, a dad smiling and calling goodbye as he dropped off his kid at school, a dad lifting a boy onto his shoulders, a dad frowning when his daughter dropped her ice cream, then buying her another one. Until now, Seth had never thought he might have a father of his own. It scared him, hoping for something. So here it was, cutting down the black grass, getting sunburn on his bare arms, feeling the hot rumble of the engine beneath him, hearing the blades whirling and loving it. Mrs. Antos knew how to use the tractor better than him, but she was sticking indoors mostly, like everyone else now. Except him and Anaya and Petra. He remembered how, outside the community center, everyone else had been sneezing like crazy, and the three of them had met each other's eyes. No one said anything, but it was like for 1 second they were all communicating, and an electric thrill had gone through them. Seth brought his attention back to plowing. He'd keep the farm in good shape until Mr. Antos came back. Then maybe they could make another start later in the summer. They'd have discovered some new herbicide by then, and everything would be back to normal. At the far end of the field, he made another turn, nice and tight this time, and headed back in the direction of the farmhouse. Mrs. Antos was hurrying down the porch steps, waving at him, and sneezing and dabbing her eyes with a tissue. He brought the tractor to a jerking halt, stalling the engine. Hopping off, he ran, and he knew he was running toward bad news. End of chapter 5.